Hello everyone, happy November! Because we're getting so close to Thanksgiving, I thought I would do a special Thanksgiving lecture just for you. So let's talk about the main group of people behind the first Thanksgiving, and that would be the Pilgrims. They were actually known as separatists. There were two types of people who came over to the New World. Some of them were the Puritans. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. They believed that it could be saved. They just needed an example to follow. The others were the Pilgrims. They thought that the British Church, or the Church of England, was beyond saving, and that the only way was to break free and start a new church and completely separate from that previous church. However, their belief systems were very similar to those of the Puritans. Both the Pilgrims and the Puritans believed in the simplicity of dress and the simplicity of life in general. Back in England, people like the Pilgrims and the Puritans were called Roundheads because they would cut their hair short. This is during a time when it was actually masculine to have long, flowing, curly locks of hair. And so to cut their hair short was basically the Pilgrims saying that we don't want to be vain, we don't want to show that we care about worldly things and our appearance, and so they cut their hair short. Pilgrims, as well as the Puritans, opposed lavish rituals, opposed hierarchy in the church, and they believed few Anglicans truly felt the presence of God. They believed in Calvinism. This is the idea of an all-knowing God where everything is predetermined in something called predestination. So the Pilgrims believed who was going to heaven and who was going to hell was already predetermined, and there wasn't really anything in your life you could do about it. What you can do is look for clues along the way during your life to see if you are possibly one of God's chosen people, one of the elect, or if you're not. They were very nitpicky even within their own society, even though they technically believed in what was known as a doctrine of grace, meaning that good works aren't what gets you into heaven. It's purely the idea that Jesus died for the sins of the world, and if you believe in Jesus, you're saved regardless of anything else. But they still believed that if you were truly a member of God's elect, that you would be a good person. Showing that commitment to God throughout your life was part of the way of showing yourself and others that you were actually one of these chosen people that was going to be going to heaven. Within the Puritan family, there was a division of labor that was pretty strict. The Puritans believed that this was something that was naturally ingrained, and they believed that it was something commanded by God. And so they were very careful to maintain the family structure that they left in England, which was the obedience of women and children and servants and anyone in the household to a male head of the household. They kind of structured their life on the beehive analogy. Before microscopes were invented, they actually thought that the king bee was male, and that was the natural order of nature, that there would be a king bee and everything else would be under him. They thought that this was mirrored at every level of society. So God and the church, the king and his people, head of the household and his family. Now, of course, once they did develop the microscope and found out that their king bee was actually a queen bee, they kind of threw this whole analogy out the window, but they didn't throw out the actual gender structure. So the Pilgrims bought a ship called the Speedwell to sail to the New World. Well, the Pilgrims ran into some bad luck right out of the gate. As soon as they set out, they ran into a storm, which forced them to turn around and return. When they set out again, then the Speedwell sprung a leak, and so they had to go back again. Some Pilgrims actually decided to give up because they didn't really seem to have God's blessing after so many things went wrong. They thought maybe God doesn't really want us to go to the New World. So they ended up renting a freighter called the Mayflower, and it was on this ship that 200 passengers set sail. Even then, they had delayed so long that they faced severe storms on their journey across the sea. They thought about turning back altogether when the main beam of the ship cracked during a particularly rough storm halfway across. So even after switching to the Mayflower, they were still having this terrible luck. The Pilgrims had purchased a patent to start a colony in the British part of North America, somewhere in present-day New York. They did not know that storms had blown them so far off course, and they ended up landing somewhere completely different. They landed at what became known as Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts.
They set off from Plymouth and landed in Plymouth. How lucky is that?
They realized they were near Cape Cod, and so they tried to travel south, but since the journey around the reef can be dangerous, they instead decided to turn back and land at the tip of the bay.
We've gone round in a circle, lads. Back on the bus.
They drew up what became known as the Mayflower Compact, and this was the first written constitution that was adopted in North America. It followed the separatist model of a self-governing religious congregation. They saw no Native Americans, so they thought there were none. They just assumed that this land was empty. They didn't realize that the native tribes moved out of the area during the fall because they didn't think it was a good place to survive the winter. That would have been really good information for them to have. 50% of those who arrived died during that first winter. Their first encounters with Native Americans didn't happen until spring of 1621 on March 16th. The Native American Samoset spoke English and seemed comfortable with Englishmen, so he became sort of a go-between and translator for them. He also returned after their first meeting with Chief Massasoit and Squanto. These two had been captured by English people as children, and that's why they spoke English. Chief Massasoit, who led the Wampanoag tribe, wanted to use the alliance against his traditional enemies. Massachusetts Native Americans had been weakened by European disease already because this was not the first European colony in the area, and they needed the protection of the settlers. The settlers also needed the help of Native Americans who knew how to live in this area when they clearly did not. Now this leads us to the advent of the first Thanksgiving. This happened in 1622 between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. It occurred sometime between September 21st and November 11th of 1621, so when we celebrate Thanksgiving, it's actually a little bit later than when they actually would have celebrated the first Thanksgiving. The theory is that the men were shooting and Native Americans heard the gunshots and came to investigate, and not wanting to start anything with the Native Americans, they invited the Native Americans to join, and they invited others, and it just kind of became a big party. So this begs the question, what did they eat at the first Thanksgiving? It probably looked quite a bit different. It included things like waterfowl, venison, ham, lobster, clams, berries, fruit. Yes, they did have pumpkin and squash, and they did probably have wild turkey. So some of the things that we eat do come from the idea of the first Thanksgiving, but not all of them. Otherwise, we'd be eating deer meat as well. And this wasn't intended to be something that was repeated year after year. This was an event that happened and was recorded, and then people kind of forgot about it for a long time. The first national proclamation of a Thanksgiving was by the Continental Congress in 1777. George Washington, who led the Revolutionary Forces, proclaimed Thanksgiving in December of 1777. Still, Thanksgiving wouldn't become super popular in American society if it weren't for the help of Sarah J. Hale. She's an editor of Godey's Lazy Book, and she wrote articles on a variety of topics. She led the charge arguing that we should observe an annual national Thanksgiving. And because she had such a big platform, she was able to get a lot of support behind the idea. Lincoln, who was president at the time, was moved by her editorials on the subject and proclaimed that Thanksgiving Day should be celebrated on the 26th, which was the final Thursday of November in 1863. Subsequent presidents followed his example and proclaimed Thanksgiving to be the last Thursday of November, but it wasn't really an official thing. It was tradition that it would be the last Thursday of November, but presidents could really put it any time that they wanted. They could technically move it if they wanted to do that. And President Roosevelt did just that in 1939. He decided to change the traditional date and declared Thanksgiving a week earlier, since November had 5 Thursdays in that month. He also thought that an earlier Thanksgiving would give merchants a longer period to sell goods before Christmas during the Great Depression. Obviously, he didn't know about Black Friday and early Christmas sales, which start like after Halloween in modern times. In all seriousness, back then, it was actually considered inappropriate to advertise for Christmas before Thanksgiving. Republicans called this change an affront to the memory of Lincoln, so people got really up in arms about this for some reason, and because it was declared by Democrat Franklin Roosevelt, they started to call it Franksgiving instead of Thanksgiving, or Democratic Thanksgiving, and they looked at the following week, November 30th of that year, as Republican Thanksgiving. So people actually had 2 Thanksgivings that year. Some celebrated one, some celebrated the other. Some people just decided to celebrate both. But after the outcry over trying to change this holiday and move it 1 week earlier, on November 6th of 1941, both houses in Congress passed a resolution that Thanksgiving would be celebrated at a fixed time on the last Thursday of the month of November. A few months later, in December of that year, they decided to fix it on the fourth Thursday of the month, regardless of whether or not there were 5 Thursdays. So the first time this went into effect was actually 1942, and that's where we get our modern Thanksgiving. And ever since then, we have celebrated Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday of the month, and that's why all of you have a week off on the fourth week of November. So I hope you've learned something about the history of this fascinating American holiday, one that honestly is very unique to our country. In a way, it represents what we want to be. The traditional story of Thanksgiving, the Disneyfied version of it, is that we got together with Native Americans and that there was peace and harmony and love, and it was us just feasting together, enjoying each other's company, and getting along. And that's what we like to think that America is, just people getting along with people who are different from them. And I think that's a really beautiful notion. Even if it doesn't match up exactly to the true history of Thanksgiving, where there was a lot of mistrust between Native Americans and the Pilgrims, it's still something that's really beautiful to think about, and still something that is worth celebrating, if nothing else, as an aspiration for what we could be and for these ideals that we have as a country. Happy Thanksgiving.